In the soft hush of a medieval dawn, as the first light filtered through the misty fields, a peasant named Thomas stirred from his slumber. The rooster's crow signaled the start of another day filled with toil and devotion. His modest cottage, constructed of wattle and daub, stood as a testament to the resilience of those who worked the land. Inside, the air was thick with the mingling scents of damp earth and the faint aroma of last night's hearth. Thomas's life, like that of many medieval peasants, was intricately woven with the rhythms of the church. The church's influence permeated every aspect of daily existence, from the ringing of the church bells marking the hours to the observance of holy days that punctuated the agrarian calendar. These feasts not only provided spiritual solace, but also dictated the times for sowing and reaping, ensuring that the sacred and the secular were inextricably linked. Despite the grueling labor and the ever-present threat of famine, Thomas found comfort in the familiar rituals of his faith. The local parish priest, Father Bernard, served as both spiritual guide and community leader. Though the Mass was conducted in Latin, a language unfamiliar to most peasants, the rituals provided a sense of continuity and hope. The Church's teachings offered explanations for the hardships of life and the promise of salvation, reinforcing its central role in them. However, the Church's presence was not solely benevolent. Peasants like Thomas were required to pay tithes, surrendering a portion of their meager harvest to support the Church's endeavors. Failure to comply could result in severe spiritual consequences, as the Church wielded the threat of eternal damnation to ensure obedience. As Thomas trudged to the fields, his thoughts were interrupted by the distant tolling of the church bell. It was a summons to prayer, a reminder of the ever-watchful presence of the Church in his life. He paused, bowed his head, and whispered a prayer, seeking strength for the day's labor and solace in the promise of divine grace. Yet, beneath the surface of this devout existence, murmurs of discontent began to stir. Whispers of reform and tales of distant uprisings reached even the most isolated villages. The seeds of change were being sown, and Thomas found himself at the cusp of a transformation that would challenge the very foundations of his world. The morning sun had risen just enough to cast long, soft shadows across the freshly turned soil. Thomas's hands were already caked with dirt. He worked in silence, side by side with his eldest son, Adam, a boy of barely 13 with a heart that already carried the quiet patience of a grown man. Their task today was weeding the vegetable plot behind the cottage, a small patch that fed the family during the lean months between harvests. Around them, the village stirred into life. A soft murmur of voices, the distant clatter of buckets at the well, and the creak of carts being loaded with kindling formed a quiet rhythm that made up the heartbeat of their world. Yet even here, in the daily routine, the church loomed large. Not physically, not always, but in mind and practice. The village chapel sat near the edge of the hill, a squat stone building wrapped in ivy, its bell tower barely taller than the trees that surrounded it. But it was more than a building. It was the center of everything. It was where people married, where they were buried, where they confessed sins they didn't always understand. It was also where they paid their dues, tithes, indulgences, and gifts to the saints in hopes of protection from illness, failed crops, or bad fortune. No one really questioned it. It was simply how things were, how things had always been. Except, now and then, someone did question. Thomas remembered the whispers last winter. An old man, nobody remembered his name, only that he came from the north, passed through their village during a heavy snow. He'd asked for shelter, offered to mend tools in return. He spoke strange things by the fire at night. Said the church didn't always speak for God. Said a man could find the truth in the scriptures himself, if only he could read them. Most villagers dismissed him as a mad traveler. Father Bernard certainly did. He warned the children to stay away, preached of heresy that following week. But Thomas had listened. Not that he agreed with the man, but something about his calm voice and weary eyes made it hard to ignore. The man left with the thaw, and no one mentioned him again. But the seed had been planted. Now, as Thomas pulled a stubborn weed from the earth, he caught himself wondering about that old traveler, about what he'd said, and about what it meant for people like him, Those who didn't know how to read, who had never seen a page of scripture for themselves, who had always relied on the priest to tell them what was holy and what was sin. Behind him, Adam cleared his throat softly. "Father," the boy said, barely above a whisper, "will we have to give the hen to Father Bernard this week?" Thomas nodded slowly, not looking up. "Aye, it's St. Bartholomew's Day, but we've only 4 hens left." "I know," Thomas said, voice low, "but we've no choice." It wasn't just the hen. It was always something. A portion of their grain. A day of work repairing the chapel's fence. Even candles, made from the fat of animals they could barely afford to eat, were expected on feast days. There were reasons, of course. Reasons Father Bernard was happy to give. But to a boy like Adam and a man like Thomas, it was starting to feel like something heavier than faith. Like weight. Invisible, but pressing down just the same. After lunch, bread, onions, and a weak broth, they walked with the rest of the villagers to the chapel. St. Bartholomew's feast wasn't one of the grand ones, but still meant Mass. The chapel was cool and dim inside, the air thick with incense. Thomas's wife, Ellen, bowed her head beside him. Little Mary, their youngest, fidgeted at her side. Father Bernard stood at the front, robed and solemn. His Latin flowed smoothly, beautifully even, but no one understood it. When he spoke in English, his words were heavy with warnings about sin, about temptation, about the wrath of God for those who disobeyed his word and his church. The message was familiar, and yet Thomas noticed the way some people shifted uncomfortably in their pews. Old Margaret, who'd buried 3 sons and now lived off the charity of her neighbors, clutched her rosary with trembling hands. Even strong-willed Edwin, the miller, who never flinched at a storm, had a furrow in his brow. After the service, people lingered outside in small groups. They spoke in hushed tones, mostly about the sermon, partly about the hen that Thomas would give the priest tomorrow. "I suppose next week he'll be wanting eggs too," Edwin muttered with a smirk, loud enough to be overheard but quiet enough to feign innocence. Thomas smiled thinly. "If we're lucky, he'll take eggs instead of Mary." Edwin chuckled, but neither of them laughed with ease. The joke wasn't far from truth. The church claimed more than hens and grain. It claimed obedience, silence time. It claimed sons for the priesthood and daughters for convents. It claimed the right to bless or curse crops, to approve marriages, to forgive or withhold forgiveness. And though Father Bernard was not cruel, he was strict, stern, loyal to the bishop and the rules. And he was watching. That evening, as Thomas sat by the fire sharpening his scythe, Ellen asked, "You'll give the hen first thing tomorrow?" "Aye." She hesitated. "Maybe you should give one of the old ones. One that's not laying. We already did that last time." Ellen fell quiet. The fire crackled between them. Then she said, "I heard something strange today, when I went to fetch water." Thomas looked up. Elise said her cousin in the next village. "Which cross?" said the priest there vanished. Vanished. Gone. No word. Just stopped showing up. People say he'd been reading the Bible himself. In English. Thomas sat back. That old traveler again came to mind. Scripture in English. The idea still felt dangerous, but also clearer, less mysterious, less tied to the weight of robes and relics. He didn't sleep well that night. The wind whispered against the shutters. The children shifted in their blankets. And somewhere in the dark, he imagined voices, calm and quiet, like the travelers, like a thought that refused to go away. Morning came with mist and dew, and with it, the task of handing over the hen. Thomas took the bird gently in his arms. It clucked softly, as if confused by the early walk. Adam offered to come, but Thomas shook his head. "Stay here. Help your mother." He didn't say why. He didn't say that he was afraid of what Father Bernard might ask next, or of what he himself might say. The path to the chapel was empty, save for a few blackbirds perched on the low stone wall that lined the road. The door was open, the priest inside, kneeling in front of the altar. The air was still, heavy with the scent of wax and dust. Thomas stepped forward, clearing his throat. Father Bernard turned. "I've brought the hen, Father." The priest rose. He was a tall man, his face lined with age and something harder to place. Weariness, perhaps. He nodded. "Thank you, Thomas. Place her by the side bench." Thomas did. Then, unable to help himself, he asked quietly, "Father, do you ever read the Bible in our tongue?" The priest froze. For a heartbeat, the chapel seemed to grow colder. "What makes you ask that?" Father Bernard's voice was calm, but his eyes sharp. "I just wonder," Thomas said, avoiding his gaze. "Sometimes I think it would be easier to understand the Word of God if it were in words we knew." Silence stretched between them. Then the priest spoke, slower this time. "There are reasons we do not. Reasons older and wiser than either of us." Thomas nodded, but didn't speak again. As he turned to leave, Father Bernard added, "Be careful what you wonder, Thomas. Not all questions lead to peace." Outside, the air was warmer. The sun had risen past the treetops. But Thomas didn't feel lighter. He felt the weight of the priest's words hanging over him like the shadow of the chapel's cross. And far down the road, coming from the direction of which cross, a rider appeared. Dust rising behind him. Cloak pulled tight. Face grim. Whatever peace Thomas had known was about to change. And in the heart of the village, the church was watching. The rider's arrival didn't cause an immediate stir, but it didn't go unnoticed either. In a village where little changed and strangers were rare, even the sound of hooves on dry earth drew eyes. He came without announcement, slowing as he entered the square, his horse's sides lathered with sweat. He wasn't armored, nor richly dressed, but something about the way he sat, upright and still, made people pause. Thomas, just returning from the chapel, caught sight of the man near the well. The stranger dismounted with care, scanning the village calmly, like he had been here before or was told exactly what to expect. His eyes met Thomas's only briefly, but it was enough. A quiet flicker of recognition, or maybe just curiosity, passed between them. The man asked for water first. Then he asked for the priest. Word spread fast. Ellen heard it from the baker's wife before Thomas even reached home. By then, the stranger had been led toward the chapel by one of the shepherd boys, and a small knot of villagers had begun to gather at a respectful distance. Inside, Father Bernard stood waiting. He had already been told, and he wore the stiff expression of a man who anticipated difficult news. The visitors spoke in a low voice, and though the chapel doors remained open, only fragments reached the ears of those nearby. Words like letter, bishop, which cross, and, most unsettling of all, translation. That last word spread quickly. Translation. It wasn't spoken often, and certainly not in reference to the Bible. The church guarded its Latin scriptures jealously. The very idea of putting them into common English was a risk, a heresy, some said. But the word had been said now, said in the open, in their chapel. Thomas stood with Edwin near the baker's stall, both pretending to inspect loaves they couldn't afford. "What do you make of it?" Edwin asked under his breath. Thomas shook his head. "I don't know, but I don't like the feeling it brings." Ellen joined them soon after, Mary in tow, her small hand curled tightly around her mother's skirt. "Is it true?" she asked quietly. "They say the rider came from the bishop. That there's trouble." "It's rumors," Thomas said. "People always talk when they don't understand." But Ellen wasn't convinced, and neither was he. By afternoon, the stranger emerged from the chapel alone. His face was unreadable. He mounted his horse without speaking to anyone and rode back down the path he had come from, his cloak snapping gently in the wind. There was no formal announcement, no explanation, just silence and questions. That evening, Father Bernard called a meeting in the chapel. Everyone came. Children sat on their parents' laps or leaned against the pews, whispering and fidgeting until the priest raised his hand for quiet. He didn't mention the visitor by name. "There are those," he began, "who believe the sacred word of God should be made common, that it should be passed around like bread or grain, that anyone, man, woman, or child, can decide what it means. But the Lord does not speak through confusion. He speaks through his church." His voice was calm but firm, his gaze scanning the pews. "The bishop reminds us that we are to be faithful, that we are to be obedient, that we are to protect our souls from heresy. And we will. I will." The message was clear. That night, few people spoke openly about the meeting, but they were thinking about it, wondering. And for Thomas, the silence wasn't comfort, it was pressure, a silence that rang louder than any sermon. The next day, life resumed, at least on the surface. The field still needed tending. The goats still needed watching. Bread still needed to be baked. But everywhere Thomas went, people glanced over their shoulders. Conversations were shorter. Smiles faded quickly. And for the first time in years, he noticed that no one lingered after chapel. It was only a week later that Thomas found the first page. He'd been clearing brush along the stream near the edge of their land. Adam had gone ahead to chase off crows from the corn rows. Ellen was mending clothes in the yard. Alone, in the damp reeds beneath a fallen branch, he saw the parchment. The ink was smeared slightly, as if someone had dropped it in haste. He picked it up carefully. The handwriting was neat. The words, English. He didn't recognize all of them, but he could read enough to understand. It was a passage from the Gospel of Luke. A parable, one he had heard many times in Latin, recited in church without ever quite knowing what it meant. Now, reading it in his own tongue, it felt different, clearer, like a message wasn't just for priests or monks. It was for him. He folded the paper and tucked it into his tunic, heart pounding. Who had left it there? That night, he showed it to Ellen after the children had gone to bed. Her eyes widened as she read. She looked at Thomas as if he'd brought fire into their home. Where did you get this? She whispered. I found it. You didn't tell Father Bernard? No. Should I have? Ellen didn't answer right away. Then she said, You shouldn't keep it here. Why not? Because if someone searches and they find it, they'll think you're part of it. Part of what? That was the question Thomas couldn't answer. Was there a rebellion forming? A movement? Or just a few people, scattered, uncertain, who wanted to understand their faith in their own way? He hid the page beneath a loose floorboard anyway. Not because he was afraid, but because he didn't want the questions that would come if someone found it. But now, he had questions of his own. Days passed. The church held an unexpected fast. A second Mass was added to the week. Father Bernard's sermons became more intense, more focused on sin, obedience, loyalty. He seemed more agitated, less patient. Then, one morning, a second page appeared, this time tucked beneath the doorframe of the woodshed. It was Matthew, the Beatitudes. Again, in English. Again, clear. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Thomas read the words aloud to Ellen in a whisper, barely believing the quiet power they carried. Who is doing this? She asked. I don't know, but someone's trying to teach us. Quietly. And that was the danger. For the first time in his life, Thomas realized that knowledge, real knowledge, could be dangerous. Not because it was wrong, but because it gave ordinary people the power to think, to ask, to doubt. And the church feared doubt more than anything. The very next week, a third parchment was found, not by Thomas, but by young Emma, the blacksmith's daughter. She brought it to her father in the open square, not understanding what it meant. By nightfall, the parchment was in Father Bernard's hands. The following morning, the chapel bell rang before sunrise. Not for Mass, for inquiry. One by one, the villagers were summoned to speak with Father Bernard, to swear loyalty, to say whether they'd seen anything, read anything, or knew anyone spreading heresy. Thomas was called late in the day. Ellen stood in the doorway as he left, her eyes wide with fear. He nodded to her once, but said nothing. He didn't know what he would say. Inside the chapel, the candles burned low. Father Bernard waited at the altar, arms crossed, face still. You were seen near the stream last week, he said without preamble. And again, near the woodshed, I work those lands. They're mine to tend. You found something not meant for you. Thomas didn't answer. Father Bernard stepped closer. You're a good man, Thomas. A father, a farmer. You want to do right by your family. So tell me now, have you read anything not given by this church? The silence stretched, heavy and unbroken. Thomas met his eyes. I read something. I didn't write it. I didn't seek it out. But I read it. Father Bernard's jaw tightened. Then you must confess. Publicly. Why? Because if you don't, others will follow you. They'll think it's safe. and it is not. Thomas said nothing. He thought of the parables, the blessings, the words that had made more sense than any sermon ever had. He thought of Adam, of Mary, of the future they might have if they didn't always live in fear. Father Bernard saw the hesitation. Refuse, and the bishop will hear of it. There are prisons, Thomas. You know that. But Thomas wasn't sure he did anymore. As he left the chapel that evening, the sky was streaked in red. The wind had picked up, and from somewhere far down the road, the sound of another rider's hooves echoed in the distance. Someone was coming again, and this time they might not be alone. By morning, the rider had reached the village. He came quietly, with no grand entrance or parade of armor. But he was not like the first man. This one bore the bishop's seal plainly on his cloak and carried himself with a practiced formality. He spoke with no warmth and wasted no time. The moment his horse stopped, he asked for Father Bernard. The villagers, barely finished with their first chores, watched in heavy silence as the priest stepped out to greet him. The two men walked into the chapel and shut the door behind them. Inside, the air grew thick with murmurs. No one needed to be told what this was. Everyone understood. An investigation had begun. By midday, the bishop's man had a list of names. It began with Emma, the blacksmith's daughter. Then the blacksmith himself, for not reporting the paper right away. Then the baker, whose son was seen carrying a scrap of parchment in his pocket. And then Thomas. He was taken from the field. No ceremony. Just two churchmen arriving at his plot and asking him, with icy politeness, to come along. He didn't resist. He didn't look back. He followed them, dust clinging to his boots, hands heavy at his sides. Ellen heard the news from Edwin, who had seen the men from a distance. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She handed Mary off to a neighbor and walked straight to the chapel. By then, Thomas was seated on a bench in the front pew. The bishop's man, he still hadn't given his name, stood a few feet away, arms folded, watching him with the cool detachment of a man checking over livestock. "Do you deny reading scripture not approved by the Holy See?" the man asked. Thomas hesitated. "I don't deny reading. I found it. It was written in English. I read it." The man narrowed his eyes slightly, as if inspecting a cracked window. "Do you possess such documents now?" "No." "Do you know who distributed them?" "No." "And yet you read them, silently, privately, without fear." "I didn't say I wasn't afraid." "Then why read them at all?" Thomas looked up. "Because they spoke to me, not as a peasant, not as someone beneath God, but as someone made in his image." That answer hung in the air for too long. Father Bernard shifted in place, lips pressed tightly together. The bishop's man glanced at him, then back to Thomas. "You are to be punished." Thomas blinked. "For reading? For disobedience? For keeping what you should have reported? For giving those around you the impression that the word of God belongs to all men freely? Doesn't it?" The man's face darkened. "You will not speak at the trial." "Trial." The word dropped like a stone. Father Bernard stepped forward, trying to soften the moment. "We will be merciful," he said. "You may confess. Publicly. Show humility. That's all we ask." Thomas looked at him. For the first time in years, he saw the priest not as a man of God, but as a man afraid of losing control. "I've done nothing shameful," Thomas said. "I will not stand in the square and lie." There was no shouting, no chains, just silence. The sort of silence that lets everyone know the worst has only just begun. The next day, the square was swept clean. A wooden platform was built hastily from scrap planks. A few benches were set for the elderly, and all the villagers were told, in no uncertain terms, to attend. Thomas stood in the center, flanked by two men from the bishop's retinue. His hands were bound, not for violence, but for symbolism. He was not to be seen as innocent. Father Bernard stood nearby, speaking in Latin. Only a few words were translated aloud. Heresy, danger, warning. His voice was low and heavy with disappointment. And then came the moment. The bishop's man stepped forward, reading from a list of charges. In possession of illicit scripture, failure to report heretical materials, promotion of disobedience among the faithful, and finally, refusal to recant. The sentence was less dramatic than people feared. No stocks, no beating, not even exile. Thomas was to be placed under church penance. He would be confined to the chapel grounds, barred from work, from his home, from speaking to others about the faith for 30 days. A symbolic gesture meant to humiliate, to remind the others what happened when you questioned too much. Ellen was not allowed to speak to him. Adam was told to stay away. Mary didn't understand why her father didn't come home. That night, Ellen wept, not just for Thomas, but for what this all meant. Because even though her husband had been punished, the parchments hadn't stopped appearing. In fact, 3 more showed up within the next week. One hidden beneath the priest's chair, another left on the baker's windowsill, and a third, most alarming of all, placed inside the collection box. Whoever was behind it wasn't afraid. They were daring the church to act. Father Bernard's sermons grew darker. He preached about fire, about the devil in plain clothes, about loyalty, about silence, about suffering. But his words no longer had the same pull. People still listened, but now they listened with caution. A quiet resistance had begun. Edwin found a 4th page. He burned it in secret, but told Ellen first. "This isn't stopping," he said. "Even after Thomas, maybe because of Thomas, it's spreading." Ellen didn't answer, but she knew it too. A week into Thomas's penance, Ellen brought bread to the chapel. She wasn't allowed to enter. A boy took the food inside. But later, that night, she returned under cover of darkness. She crept behind the chapel, found the window Thomas once fixed with his own hands, tapped the frame. A hand reached out slowly. His. They couldn't speak long or loud, but he told her something she didn't expect. "There's more coming." "What do you mean?" He hesitated. That first writer, he wasn't just delivering a warning. He was testing to see if there was readiness here, to see if anyone was willing. Ellen's mouth went dry. For what? For a new kind of faith. He handed her a folded scrap, a message, but not in scripture. It was a list of names, nearby villagers in other towns. People like them. People who had also found pages. Some are hiding. Some have been arrested. But some are organizing, trying to make a network, trying to translate more, trying to keep the message alive. Ellen's hands shook as she took the paper. "Why give this to me?" "Because they'll never let me walk out of here." "But they'll never suspect you." The wind shifted, a noise by the road. Ellen stepped back, tucked the paper in her sleeve, and vanished into the night. That was the moment it all changed. Ellen, the healer, the mother, the quiet wife, became more than anyone had guessed. She wouldn't burn the paper. She wouldn't hide it in the floorboards. She would find the others. And though her hands trembled, her heart did not. Because she had heard the word, not from a pulpit, not from a priest, but from her own husband's lips. And now it was her turn to carry it forward. Ellen didn't sleep that night. Not really. She lay next to Mary, listening to the child's steady breathing, her small hand curled under her chin. But her own thoughts churned like storm clouds. The names on the parchment were burned into her mind. 7 of them, some with only a first name, some with the name of a village beside it. These were not rebels. They were just people, just like her. And yet, somehow, they had become part of something so much bigger than themselves. Before dawn, Ellen rose quietly. She wrapped the paper in cloth and placed it inside a pouch tied tightly at her waist. She kissed Mary's forehead, whispered a soft promise to return, and stepped into the cold gray morning. Her first stop was Edwin. The farmer was already outside, checking the frostbite on his cabbage leaves. He looked up when he saw her approaching and immediately wiped his hands on his tunic. His expression said it all. He had expected this moment, feared it, and yet, here it was. "You're leaving," he said, not as a question. "I need to know who these people are," she replied, pulling out the parchment. "And I think you know someone who can help." Edwin nodded slowly, glancing around. "There's a man in Ormsby," he said. "Old, hunched, sells herbs. But that's not what he's known for." "What is he known for?" Edwin hesitated. "They say he remembers the old days, before the strict laws, when scripture was read in the tongue of the people, not cloaked in Latin. He might know some of these names." Ellen didn't flinch. "Where is Ormsby?" "North. Half a day's walk if you keep your pace." She thanked him and turned to go, but Edwin called out, "Ellen, if they catch you. They won't, she said firmly, without looking back. She didn't believe it entirely, but she said it like she did. The road to Ormsby was narrow and uneven. Frost made the edges slick, and the air bit at her cheeks. Still, she kept moving, her steps quiet but sure. Occasionally, she'd pass another traveler, a peddler, a boy with sheep, an older woman balancing a basket of fish, but no one looked twice at her. A woman on foot was nothing strange. By midday, she saw the first rooftops. Ormsby was smaller than her own village. Quieter, too. It had a kind of emptiness, as if it had once been fuller, but some part of it had been hollowed out and never replaced. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, and in the distance, a bell rang once, sharply. She asked a washerwoman by the stream where she could find the old herb cellar. The woman pointed with a soapy hand to a crooked hut near the woods. The man inside was smaller than she expected. He sat near a fire, wrapped in a gray shawl, his eyes sharp beneath thick brows. When Ellen knocked, he didn't move. Just said, "If it's for bruises, I've got arnica. If it's for your belly, I've got mint." "I'm not here for herbs," Ellen said. He finally looked at her, and she could tell. He knew. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I was told you know names," she said, pulling the parchment from her pouch. The man's hand trembled slightly as he took it. He read the list slowly, lips moving in silence. "I know 3, he said finally. "The others, maybe. But these 3, they've written before. One in Darnwick, one in the West Hills. The last, she's not far." Ellen leaned forward. "Who?" "She lives in the woods, not far from here. A widow. Name's Breda. Some say she's mad. Some say she's a prophet. Depends who you ask. I want to find her." The man nodded. "You'll need to be careful. The bishop's men came through 2 nights ago, asking questions. Breda's name came up. I didn't say anything." Ellen felt her pulse quicken. "Can you point the way?" He rose slowly and shuffled to the door. Outside, he pointed to a small path that twisted behind a rise of birch trees. "Take that way. You'll see a broken stone fence. Go left, past the tree stump with the iron hook in it. Then listen for the sound of wind chimes. That's her." Ellen thanked him and set off again, her boots already aching. But her spirit was steady. It took nearly an hour to reach the edge of the woods. There she paused. The trees stood like guards, tall and unmoving. The air was colder here, quieter. She walked carefully, eyes scanning every corner. Just past the broken stone fence, she turned left. The iron hook was rusted and buried in moss, but she saw it. Then, as the man had promised, she heard them. Wind chimes, soft and eerie, tinkling like whispered voices. The hut appeared slowly, as if rising from the earth. It was built low, with thick timber walls and windows too small to see clearly through. The chimes hung from a branch above the door, swaying gently despite the still air. Ellen knocked. No answer. She knocked again. Then the door creaked open just a little, and a voice said, "You shouldn't be here." "I'm looking for Breda," Ellen said. "You found her. I need help. My husband, he's been punished by the church. For reading. For knowing." The door opened wider. Breda was taller than Ellen expected. She had wild gray hair, skin darkened by sun and time, and eyes that looked right through you. "Come inside," she said. The inside of the hut smelled like dried lavender and wood smoke. Papers hung from the beams above, pinned like laundry. Some were covered in words Ellen couldn't read. Others had drawings, symbols, maps, maybe prayers. Breda sat down and motioned for Ellen to do the same. "You have a message," she said. "I can feel it." Ellen handed her the parchment. Breda read it once, then again, and again. Finally, she said, "These people, they're part of something. Quiet, slow, like roots growing under frost. The church doesn't see them yet, but it will. Thomas said they're building something. A network." Breda nodded. "They are, but it's fragile. One wrong step, one careless word, and it all comes crashing down." Ellen took a deep breath. "Then I want to help. Quietly, carefully, however I can." Breda's eyes softened. "You're brave. I'm tired of being afraid." There was a long silence. Then Breda reached for a book beneath her table. It was bound in cloth, worn and weathered. She placed it gently in Ellen's hands. "This is the beginning," she said. "Take it, hide it, learn from it, and when the time is right, pass it on." Ellen clutched the book to her chest, heart pounding. Outside, the wind picked up. Back in her village, the church was watching. But in these woods, in this quiet hut, something else had started. A flicker of light, a spark that wouldn't go out easily, even if no one saw it yet, even if it had to burn in secret. Ellen left Brida's hut with the cloth-wrapped book pressed tightly against her side. The forest around her had grown darker, the afternoon sun dipping low behind the treetops, casting long, stretched shadows across the path. Every rustle of branches and crack of twigs beneath her boots felt louder, like the woods were holding their breath. The weight of what she carried was more than pages and ink. It was knowledge, dangerous knowledge. In a world where the church controlled who could read, who could speak, and who could think aloud, this book was more dangerous than any weapon. And yet, it felt right in her hands, almost familiar, like it belonged with her. By the time she reached the outskirts of Ormsby again, the first stars were pricking the sky. She didn't stop. Not in the village, not for water, not even when her legs burned and her back ached. She kept walking until the night swallowed the last of the road, and still she pressed forward. Mary would be waiting, and the more time passed, the more she worried that someone, something, might be watching the same path she had taken. She reached her village close to midnight. Smoke curled from chimneys, and windows glowed with faint candlelight here and there, but the streets were mostly still. She wrapped the book tighter and walked with her head down, looking no different than a tired washerwoman heading home after tending to a sick neighbor. When she opened the door to her home, Mary stirred from her blanket and blinked sleepily. "Mama, I'm here, little one," Ellen whispered, kneeling to gather her into her arms. "Everything is all right." And for that moment it was, but morning came, as it always did, and with it the sound of hooves. Ellen was at the well when she heard them. 4 riders, moving slow, deliberate. They weren't local. Their clothes were too clean, their armor polished, their faces hard like men who had ridden through more than one burning village. She turned her face away, tugging her hood lower. The men dismounted and walked straight to the church. Whispers spread fast in a village like hers. The bishop's men had returned, looking for someone, or something. No one knew for sure, but suspicion was a faster poison than certainty. Ellen kept to herself that day, chopping roots in the yard, keeping Mary close, pretending the chill in her stomach wasn't fear creeping in. She had buried the book under the floorboards, wrapped in oilcloth. Still, she felt like it burned through the wooden slats. That evening, as the bells rang for vespers, Thomas appeared at her door. She let him in quickly, locking the door behind him. "You've seen them?" he asked, his voice low. Ellen nodded. "Just now." They went into the church. Thomas paced the small room, fingers twisting together. "I've heard things. In other villages. They're tightening the cords. Anyone caught with even a torn page of forbidden scripture, flogged, sometimes worse." "I went to Ormsby," Ellen said, watching his reaction carefully. His eyes widened. "I met Brida," she continued, "and she gave me this." She pulled the book from beneath the floorboards and set it on the table. Thomas stared at it for a long moment before sitting down across from her. "You have no idea what this is," he said, almost in awe. "I know enough," Ellen said. "I know it's truth, and I know truth shouldn't be buried." Thomas looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, there was something fragile in his face, like a man who had been fighting a battle alone for far too long and finally saw another person standing beside him. "This is a copy of the old text," he said, "before the church locked it away, before they decided who got to speak to God." Ellen said nothing. She only nodded. "You need to hide it better," he added. "If they come, they'll tear this place apart." "I will." Then he leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. "There are more of us. Quiet ones. Farmers. Bakers. Weavers. No swords. Just ideas." "Where?" "Everywhere," he said. "But we don't all know each other. Safer that way." She glanced down at the names on the parchment again. "And these? Some are already dead," Thomas said grimly. "Some disappeared, but others are still speaking, still writing. You met one. There are more. And they're not giving up? He shook his head. They can't. Not now. Not after what's been lost. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then from outside, a knock on the door. Not loud. Not soft. Just firm. Thomas froze. Ellen stood slowly and motioned for him to hide. He slipped behind a curtain near the hearth, tucking himself into the shadows. Another knock. She opened the door. One of the riders stood there, tall and sharp-eyed. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword. "Good evening, miss," he said, far too pleasant. "Evening," Ellen replied, her voice steady. "You're Ellen of Craybrook?" "I am." He gave a short nod. "We've had word of unusual activity in this village. Strange visitors. Whispered gatherings." "I don't know anything about that," she said calmly. "I tend herbs. Raise my girl. I keep to myself." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Mind if we look around?" She hesitated. "Just enough." He stepped forward. "It's not a request." She opened the door wider. The two other riders entered behind him. Their boots thudded against the floor. One began rifling through shelves. Another peered into the sleeping area. Ellen stood perfectly still. The last rider stepped toward the hearth, toward the curtain. Her heart stopped. But just then, Mary stirred and let out a soft cry. One of the men turned to her, surprised. "A child." "My daughter," Ellen said, quickly stepping to her side. The man at the hearth paused, then turned back. The lead rider muttered. "Nothing strange here, then." He looked around one last time, then gave a slight nod. "Apologies for the disturbance." Ellen nodded, eyes careful. They left without another word. Only after their hoofbeats faded did Thomas emerge from behind the curtain. His face was pale. "You can't stay here," he said. Ellen nodded. "I know." The scream echoed in Ellen's ears long after it faded into the trees. Her legs didn't stop, but her heart did. Just for a moment. She wanted to turn around, to run back to where Thomas had fallen. But her child was in her arms, clutching her neck, whispering, "Mama, I'm scared," over and over. Branches tore at her shawl. Thorns scratched her face. Still she ran, not knowing where the others were, or if any of them had made it out. The forest closed around her like a clenched fist. She kept moving, breath ragged, feet bruised and wet from the muddy ground. Mary had gone silent now, head against her chest. Ellen feared the worst, until she felt the child's shallow, warm breath against her collarbone. She stumbled into a low ravine and crouched beneath a thick cluster of roots from an old fallen oak. There, half buried under moss and earth, she curled around Mary and tried to make them disappear. It was quiet again. Too quiet. Had Thomas died? Had he been captured? Was anyone still alive? Her thoughts circled like ravens in a storm. Hours passed. Maybe more. She lost track of time. The sky had started to pale with the first light of morning when she heard footsteps nearby. Slow, careful. Not horses this time. Not armored boots. Someone light. Someone moving with purpose, but not pursuit. Ellen froze, listening. The steps came closer, then stopped. "Ellen." It was Rafe. She called out weakly, and in a moment, he was at the edge of the roots, face drawn and eyes filled with relief. "You made it," he whispered. She shook her head. "Thomas." "I don't know. I saw him fall, but he shouted for us to run. That gave us a chance. He knew what he was doing." Ellen wanted to believe that, but the look on Rafe's face held more truth than comfort. He didn't say Thomas was alive. He only said Thomas gave them a chance. They traveled the rest of the morning together, stopping only to drink from a shallow stream. Mary walked now, drowsy but quiet. Her small hand never left her mother's. Eventually, they found a trail, half overgrown, twisted, lined with the bones of long-dead trees, and followed it deeper into the woods. By midday, they reached the abandoned fort. It wasn't much. Just crumbled stone walls, swallowed by ivy, and a central tower, now broken and hollow. But the ground beneath it held a cellar once used for storage. The door was hidden under loose stones, and when they pried it open, the dark inside smelled like dust and forgotten prayers. 6 others were already there. Faces Ellen recognized. One was the old woman with the white hair. She looked up when Ellen entered, her eyes sharp but kind. "You're safe," she said softly. "We mourn the rest later. Now, We remember why we endure. That night, they lit no candles. The cellar was pitch black, but they didn't need light to speak. Their voices were hushed, stories whispered between sips of water and broken bread. They spoke of the first time the church had burned books in the square, of the villagers who had refused to bow and paid dearly, of the monastery's last abbot who tried to hide the sacred texts before the soldiers came. Ellen sat in silence, holding Mary against her. She listened to every word, not just for the stories, but for the meaning behind them. These weren't just memories. They were warnings. They were truth. Rafe leaned toward her and spoke quietly. The church wasn't always like this. Centuries ago, there were those who truly served the people. Monks who farmed and healed. Priests who protected the poor. But somewhere along the line, power took root. She nodded. And now they fear what they can't control. So they call it heresy, and they burn it. Ellen thought of Thomas again. How he'd tried to speak out when Father Aldrich's sermons turned cruel. How he'd argued that the Bible shouldn't be chained to altars, read only by men in gold robes. He believed that ordinary people, peasants even, had the right to understand, to question, to learn. That belief had cost him everything. The next few days were restless. They didn't stay long in one place. The group moved carefully through old trails, switching shelters at dawn and dusk, avoiding villages and keeping their conversations brief. They lived like ghosts, slipping between ruins, hiding in abandoned barns, eating whatever they could carry or find. A rotten apple could be a feast, a scrap of cheese, a treasure. But there were moments, brief, fleeting, when something like peace touched them. One morning, Ellen woke to find Mary giggling softly as she played with a moth fluttering in the light that streamed through a crack in the cellar door. Her laughter was so gentle, so pure, it broke something open in Ellen's chest. It reminded her of who they were before the fear, before the sermons filled with threats, before the bishop's men rode into their village and burned the healer's hut, before the monks disappeared and the crosses were replaced by iron. But the fear always returned. One evening, while camped in a stone well house on the edge of a clearing, a young boy named Edric, barely 12, spotted smoke on the horizon. Not from a cooking fire, from a controlled burn. The kind soldiers used to clear woods, to flush out those in hiding. They're closing in, Rafe said grimly. They're not hunting us. Not exactly. They're erasing places, one by one. The old woman with the white hair sat down beside Ellen. What they fear most is the truth. Not swords, not rebellion. Words, memory, stories like yours, and mine, and hers, she said, pointing to Mary. That's why we carry them. Ellen looked at the girl. But what if we can't pass them on? You already are, the woman replied. It was true in a way Ellen didn't fully understand until later that night, when Mary asked her to tell the story again. About the time the baker's wife stood up to the bishop and threw a stale loaf at his feet. The tale wasn't even true. Or maybe it was. But Mary laughed, and the others smiled in the dark, and for a moment, the world felt almost possible again. Still, the danger never faded. Their numbers had shrunk, their energy drained. Yet the mission, the message, had grown heavier. The church wasn't just after them because of stolen texts or whispered prayers. It was what they represented, proof that peasants could remember, that they could speak, that they could keep the truth alive even when forbidden to. And there were rumors now, spoken low, like secrets carried by the wind. A bishop had died, poisoned, they said. A village had refused to kneel, burned to ash the next day. But somewhere else, a priest had defied the order to report heretics and instead sheltered a family for 2 nights before disappearing. Some said the old ways were stirring again, that deeper than the church's reach, something ancient had never truly died. Ellen didn't know what to believe. She only knew this. They would keep running, keep teaching, keep surviving, not just for themselves, but for the chance that one day Mary might live in a world where knowing how to read didn't mean risking your life. And on the edge of that thought, on the verge of some new understanding, there came the unmistakable sound of a voice shouting in the distance. A warning. Too close this time. They were no longer being erased quietly. This time, The hunt had truly begun. The shouting shattered the fragile calm like a stone thrown into still water. Ellen's heart hammered against her ribs as she scrambled to gather the others in the dim cellar. Mary clung to her tightly, eyes wide and trembling. The group moved silently but swiftly, extinguishing what little light they had and pressing against cold, rough stone walls. Outside, the echoes of heavy boots and shouted commands grew louder, closer. Rafe whispered, "They know where we are." Ellen swallowed the lump in her throat, trying to steady her voice. "We can't stay. We have to move." The old woman nodded, her face pale but resolute. "There's a tunnel beneath the well house. It leads to the river. We can escape there, but it's narrow and dangerous. And we don't know if they've blocked the other side." Every breath felt heavy, every second stretched thin. The tension wrapped around them like a suffocating blanket. No one spoke above a whisper. Mary's small hands gripped Ellen's shirt so tightly it left marks. Ellen looked down at her daughter and thought about all they had already lost. Their home, their peace, their friends. And now, even safety felt like a distant dream. "Lead the way," she said quietly. One by one, they climbed into the dark tunnel. The air was damp and cold. Water dripped from the ceiling, and the earth beneath their feet was slick with mud. Ellen could barely see, but she trusted Rafe's steady steps ahead. The walls closed in as they went deeper, forcing them to crouch low, to crawl in places. The fear of being caught, of the walls collapsing, of never seeing the sky again, pressed down on her chest. At times, the tunnel opened into small caverns where they paused to catch their breath. The others stayed close, offering soft words and brief smiles to keep the hope alive. But Ellen's mind raced. How many times had the church's soldiers burned villages and slaughtered those who resisted? How many more would die before this ended? Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a wider chamber with a low archway leading to a faint light. The sound of rushing water grew louder. They were near the river. Ellen took Mary's hand, feeling the child's trembling fingers. "Almost there," she whispered. But as they stepped toward the light, a shout from behind froze them all. "Stop! In the name of the church." Rafe spun around, drawing a small dagger. "Run," he yelled. They scattered in the darkness, the narrow tunnel splitting into two paths. Ellen grabbed Mary and darted down the right side, heart pounding so loud she thought it would give her away. The sound of footsteps followed, echoing and multiplying. She stumbled over rocks and roots, tears blurring her vision. Then, suddenly, the ground gave way beneath her feet. Ellen fell hard, pain exploding in her ankle. She cried out, dropping Mary as she tumbled into a shallow pool of icy water below. Mary's small cry reached her before she could move, and Ellen's heart nearly broke. "Mary!" she called, pushing herself up. The water soaked through her clothes, chilling her to the bone. The tunnel above rumbled. Dust and small stones fell like rain. Footsteps drew nearer. "Ellen, are you there?" Rafe's voice shouted. "Yes," she answered, struggling to stand. The ankle was sharp with pain, but she forced herself to move. Mary was crying, soaked but unharmed. "We have to keep going," Ellen said through clenched teeth. "We can't stay." Together, they limped toward the faint light. The air grew fresher, filled with the scent of moss and wet stone. Finally, the tunnel ended at a narrow opening just above the river's edge. They crawled out, gasping as the cool night air hit their faces. Behind them, the tunnel collapsed with a final roar. The church's men would not follow. For now, Ellen sat on the muddy bank, holding Mary close. The stars reflected in the water, cold and distant. They were free, for a moment, but nowhere was safe. The river ran fast, wild, cutting through the dark woods like a silver serpent. "We can't go back," Rafe said quietly. "We have to find help," Ellen replied, voice breaking. But where? Who could they trust when the church's shadow stretched over every village, every farm, every path? The old woman pulled a folded piece of parchment from her cloak. "There is a place," she said softly. "A village beyond the hills where the church's reach is weaker. A place where the old ways are still whispered." Ellen looked at the map, traced the faded lines with her finger. It was far, dangerous, but maybe their last hope. As they planned their journey, the wind carried a chilling sound, the distant toll of a bell. Not a call to prayer, but a warning. The church was sending its message, and it was coming for them. The morning light filtered through the trees as they set out, leaving the river behind. The path was rough and overgrown, winding through hills and shadowed forests. Ellen's ankle throbbed with every step, but she refused to rest. Mary walked beside her, eyes wide but silent, clutching a small wooden carving Thomas had made before he vanished. The group moved quietly, always alert. The stories they carried with them were like invisible chains, binding them to a past they couldn't forget and a future they had yet to reach. Rafe spoke little, but when he did, his words were sharp with reality. The church is more than priests and soldiers. It's fear made flesh. It hunts not just bodies, but minds. Ellen nodded, understanding too well. The sermons, the punishments, the silence forced on their tongues, all tools to erase history, to erase them. One night, by the flicker of a small fire hidden beneath the trees, the old woman told a story from her youth, of a time when peasants dared to learn, to read, to dream. Of secret gatherings in the forest where books were shared like treasures and prayers were whispered not just to saints, but to hope itself. But the church caught them, she said, voice low. One by one, they disappeared, burned or worse, their names forgotten. Ellen felt the weight of those lost voices. They had inherited their courage and their fear. Will we be next? Mary asked quietly, sitting close. Ellen pulled her close, brushing back damp hair. Not if we keep their stories alive. They pressed on, carrying the flickering light of memory through a world grown dark. But as the hills gave way to a clearing, a figure appeared on the path ahead. A lone rider cloaked in black, eyes shining like embers in the fading light. For a heartbeat, Ellen thought it was a friend. Then the rider lifted a hand, and the gleam of a sword caught the last rays of the sun. The hunt was far from over. The scream echoed in Ellen's ears long after it faded into the trees. Her legs didn't stop, but her heart did. Just for a moment. She wanted to turn around, to run back to where Thomas had fallen. But her child was in her arms, clutching her neck, whispering, "Mama, I'm scared," over and over. Branches tore at her shawl. Thorns scratched her face. Still she ran, not knowing where the others were or if any of them had made it out. The forest closed around her like a clenched fist. She kept moving, breath ragged, feet bruised and wet from the muddy ground. Mary had gone silent now, head against her chest. Ellen feared the worst, until she felt the child's shallow, warm breath against her collarbone. She stumbled into a low ravine and crouched beneath a thick cluster of roots from an old fallen oak. There, half buried under moss and earth, she curled around Mary and tried to make them disappear. It was quiet again. Too quiet. Had Thomas died? Had he been captured? Was anyone still alive? Her thoughts circled like ravens in a storm. Hours passed. Maybe more. She lost track of time. The sky had started to pale with the first light of morning when she heard footsteps nearby. Slow, careful. Not horses this time. Not armored boots. Someone light. Someone moving with purpose but not pursuit. Ellen froze, listening. The steps came closer, then stopped. "Ellen!" It was Rafe. She called out weakly, and in a moment he was at the edge of the roots, face drawn and eyes filled with relief. "You made it," he whispered. She shook her head. "Thomas, I don't know. I saw him fall, but he shouted for us to run. That gave us a chance. He knew what he was doing." Ellen wanted to believe that, but the look on Rafe's face held more truth than comfort. He didn't say Thomas was alive. He only said Thomas gave him a chance. They traveled the rest of the morning together, stopping only to drink from a shallow stream. Mary walked now, drowsy but quiet. Her small hand never left her mother's. Eventually, they found a trail, half overgrown, twisted, lined with the bones of long-dead trees, and followed it deeper into the woods. By midday, they reached the abandoned fort. It wasn't much. Just crumbled stone walls, swallowed by ivy, and a central tower now broken and hollow. But the ground beneath it held a cellar once used for storage. The door was hidden under loose stones, and when they pried it open, the dark inside smelled like dust and forgotten prayers. 6 others were already there. Faces Ellen recognized. One was the old woman with the white hair. She looked up when Ellen entered, her eyes sharp but kind. "You're safe," she said softly. "We mourn the rest later. Now, we remember why we endure." That night, they lit no candles. The cellar was pitch black, but they didn't need light to speak. Their voices were hushed, stories whispered between sips of water and broken bread. They spoke of the first time the church had burned books in the square, of the villagers who had refused to bow and paid dearly, of the monastery's last abbot who tried to hide the sacred texts before the soldiers came. Ellen sat in silence, holding Mary against her. She listened to every word, not just for the stories, but for the meaning behind them. These weren't just memories. They were warnings. They were truth. Rafe leaned toward her and spoke quietly. The church wasn't always like this. Centuries ago, there were those who truly served the people. Monks who farmed and healed. Priests who protected the poor. But somewhere along the line, power took root. She nodded. And now they fear what they can't control. So they call it heresy. And they burn it. Ellen thought of Thomas again. How he tried to speak out when Father Aldrich's sermons turned cruel. How he'd argued that the Bible shouldn't be chained to altars, read only by men in gold robes. He believed that ordinary people, peasants, even had the right to understand, to question, to learn. That belief had cost him everything. The next few days were restless. They didn't stay long in one place. The group moved carefully through old trails, switching shelters at dawn and dusk, avoiding villages and keeping their conversations brief. They lived like ghosts, slipping between ruins, hiding in abandoned barns, eating whatever they could carry or find. A rotten apple could be a feast, a scrap of cheese, a treasure. But there were moments, brief, fleeting, when something like peace touched them. One morning, Ellen woke to find Mary giggling softly as she played with a moth fluttering in the light that streamed through a crack in the cellar door. Her laughter was so gentle, so pure, it broke something open in Ellen's chest. It reminded her of who they were before the fear, before the sermons filled with threats, before the bishop's men rode into their village and burned the healer's hut, before the monks disappeared and the crosses were replaced by iron. But the fear always returned. One evening, while camped in a stone well house on the edge of a clearing, a young boy named Edric, barely 12, spotted smoke on the horizon. Not from a cooking fire, from control burn. The kind soldiers used to clear woods to flush out those in hiding. "They're closing in," Rafe said grimly. "They're not hunting us." "Not exactly. They're erasing places, one by one." The old woman with the white hair sat down beside Ellen. "What they fear most is the truth. Not swords, not rebellion. Words, memory, stories like yours, and mine, and hers," she said, pointing to Mary. "That's why we carry them." Ellen looked at the girl. "But what if we can't pass them on?" "You already are," the woman replied. It was true in a way Ellen didn't fully understand until later that night, when Mary asked her to tell the story again, about the time the baker's wife stood up to the bishop and threw a stale loaf at his feet. The tale wasn't even true, or maybe it was. But Mary laughed, and the others smiled in the dark, and for a moment, the world felt almost possible again. Still, the danger never faded. Their numbers had shrunk, their energy drained, yet the mission, the message, had grown heavier. The church wasn't just after them because of stolen texts or whispered prayers. It was what they represented, proof that peasants could remember, that they could speak, that they could keep the truth alive even when forbidden to. And there were rumors now, spoken low, like secrets carried by the wind. A bishop had died, poisoned, they said. A village had refused to kneel, burned to ash the next day. But somewhere else, a priest had defied the order to report heretics and instead sheltered a family for 2 nights before disappearing. Some said the old ways were stirring again, that deeper than the church's reach, something ancient had never truly died. Ellen didn't know what to believe. She only knew this: they would keep running, keep teaching, keep surviving. not just for themselves, but for the chance that one day Mary might live in a world where knowing how to read didn't mean risking your life. And on the edge of that thought, on the verge of some new understanding, there came the unmistakable sound of a voice shouting in the distance. A warning. Too close this time. They were no longer being erased quietly. This time, the hunt had truly begun. Ellen's breath caught in her throat as the rider drew nearer, the sharp glint of the sword unsettling in the dim light. The figure's face remained hidden beneath a heavy hood, but there was something familiar in the way the rider moved, calm, deliberate, almost cold. "Who goes there?" Rafe called, stepping forward protectively, his dagger ready. The rider stopped a few paces away, the horse's hooves sinking softly into the earth. "I bring a message," the voice said, low, steady, and without warmth. Ellen's heart pounded, every muscle tensed. The danger they had fled seemed to close in around them again, faster than she could have imagined. The old woman beside her shifted, clutching the map tighter as if it might vanish. "What message?" Ellen asked, tried to keep her voice steady. The rider's gaze flicked toward Mary, who huddled behind Ellen. "The church watches. It knows you fled through the tunnels, escaped by the river. It knows where you are." A chill ran through Ellen's veins. How could they know so much? Their careful planning, their desperate flight. Had it all been for nothing? "You have two choices," the rider continued. "Return to your homes and submit, or face the consequences of defiance." Ellen swallowed, looking to Rafe and the old woman. They shared the same grim understanding. There was no safe place left. Before Ellen could respond, the rider raised a hand, signaling the horse to turn. The church is patient, but its patience has limits. With a flick of the reins, the rider disappeared into the forest shadows as silently as they had come. The group stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the threat settling heavily around them. Mary whimpered softly, and Ellen held her close, tried to hold back the tide of fear rising within her. "We can't run forever," Rafe said quietly, "but we can choose where to stand." The old woman nodded, eyes shining with determination. "There are others like us, those who remember the old ways. We must find them." Ellen looked at the map again, tracing the path to the distant village marked with a faded symbol, an ancient tree encircled by stars. It was rumored to be a refuge for those who refused to bow to the church's iron will, a place where knowledge and faith lived quietly in the shadows. But reaching it would mean crossing lands thick with danger, soldiers, spies, and the ever-watchful eyes of the church's enforcers. That night, as the group camped beneath the whispering branches of ancient oaks, Ellen lay awake, thoughts swirling like restless shadows. She thought of her family, of the life they had lost, and the uncertain road ahead. Mary slept peacefully beside her, innocent and unaware of the storm that threatened to engulf them. Ellen wondered if they would ever find safety, or if the church's shadow would follow them to the very edges of the world. Dawn broke with a muted glow, the mist hanging low over the fields. The journey resumed, each step heavier than the last. The forest grew thicker, the air colder. Strange noises echoed in the distance. Unseen creatures stirring, or perhaps the restless spirits of those who had suffered before. Rafe moved ahead with practiced caution, his eyes scanning every movement. The old woman murmured prayers in a forgotten tongue, her voice barely audible but steady. Ellen clung to the hope that somewhere beyond these woods lay a place of peace, where the stories of the past could be told without fear. But as they reached the edge of a clearing, a sudden silence fell, a silence so complete it pressed on their ears and hearts alike. From the shadows stepped figures cloaked in dark robes, faces hidden beneath heavy hoods. They formed a circle, blocking the path forward. Ellen's breath hitched. The church's enforcers. One stepped forward, raising a hand. "You carry forbidden knowledge," the voice said coldly. "You bear the mark of heresy." Rafe drew his dagger, eyes blazing. "We carry only truth." The enforcer smiled, a cruel twist of lips. "Truth is what we decide." The standoff stretched taut, every second filled with danger. Ellen held Mary close, her heart screaming for escape, for mercy, for a miracle. Suddenly, from the depths of the forest, a sharp whistle cut through the air. The enforcers hesitated. Before anyone could react, a figure burst from the trees. A young man, wild-eyed and breathing hard. "Run," he shouted. "They're coming. More are coming." Chaos erupted as the group broke through the circle, sprinting into the thick woods. Behind them, the enforcers shouted orders, the sound of boots pounding against earth. Ellen's ankle screamed in protest, but she pushed forward, pulling Mary with her. The wild-eyed youth ran beside them, his presence a strange mixture of hope and mystery. They darted through brambles and fallen branches, the forest swallowing their desperate flight. Ellen's mind raced. Who was this young man? How had he found them? And could they trust him? As they slowed beneath a canopy of towering pines, the youth finally spoke, voice urgent but low. "My name is Bram," he said. "I know the village you seek. I can take you there." Ellen exchanged a glance with Rafe and the old woman. Trust was a luxury they could barely afford, but so was hope. "Then lead the way," she said. The journey resumed, deeper into the unknown. The weight of the church's pursuit pressed on them, but for the first time in days, Ellen felt a flicker of something like courage. They moved through the twilight of the ancient forest, shadows stretching long and strange. The secrets of the past and the dangers of the present wove together in a tapestry too complex to unravel. And somewhere ahead, the promise of refuge and a reckoning waited in silence. The first light of dawn was a pale glow filtering through the thick canopy, casting long, restless shadows across the worn faces of Ellen and the others. Sleep had been a stranger, replaced by a tight knot of anxiety and the unyielding weight of what lay ahead. The young woman who had appeared at their camp introduced herself as Leora, her voice steady but tinged with a quiet urgency. She spoke of the village, called Eldermore, a place where the church's presence was thinner, where old beliefs still lingered in whispered prayers and secret gatherings. "We don't have much time," Leora said, her eyes flickering toward the east where the sun began to rise. "The church's patrols have grown bolder. They've started rounding up anyone suspected of holding to the old ways. Eldermore isn't as safe as it once was." Rafe tightened his grip on his dagger, the lines of his face hardening with resolve. "Then we move fast. We can't let fear hold us back." Ellen nodded, but inside, a storm of doubt churned. The thought of stepping into a village under siege, a place where trust was scarce and danger ever present, made her stomach twist. Yet for Mary's sake, for all their sakes, they had no choice. As they broke camp, the forest seemed to close behind them like a curtain, swallowing the path they had taken. The air was cooler now, carrying the sharp scent of damp earth and pine. Bram led the way once more, his knowledge of the wild their only shield against the church's relentless pursuit. The journey to Eldermore was fraught with small dangers, the snap of a twig, a sudden gust of wind that sounded like whispered warnings. Each step forward felt like walking a tightrope stretched over an abyss of uncertainty. Ellen found herself thinking about the church and its role in their lives. It had been more than a place of worship. It was a force that shaped every moment, from birth to death. The church's rituals, its teachings, its judgment, it was woven into the fabric of the medieval world. But for many peasants like her family, it was also a source of fear and control. The church claimed to guide souls, but it also demanded obedience, punishing those who questioned or resisted. The inquisitions, the sermons condemning heresy, the trials where silence was safer than speech, all these had left scars deeper than any visible wound. Ellen's thoughts drifted to Agatha, whose weathered hands still trembled slightly as she clutched her prayer beads. Agatha carried stories of a time before the church's iron grip, a time when people lived closer to the land, when old gods and spirits were part of everyday life. That knowledge was dangerous now, a secret that could mean death. As the sun climbed higher, the trees thinned, and the landscape opened to rolling hills dotted with wildflowers and patches of farmland struggling to survive. Smoke curled from distant chimneys, signs of life and perhaps safety. But as they approached, the signs of struggle became harder to ignore. Fields lay fallow where crops had been trampled or burned. Huts stood empty or in ruins, doors hanging open like silent invitations to ghosts. The village they sought was scarred by fear and conflict. Leora's voice was low as she pointed toward a cluster of buildings still standing near a sparkling stream. That's the heart of Eldermore. We should find shelter there, but we must be careful. The church's watchmen could be anywhere. The group moved cautiously, each footstep measured and quiet. Ellen's heart pounded as they slipped between buildings, shadows among shadows. Faces peeked from behind curtains and cracked doors, eyes filled with suspicion, hope, and exhaustion. A man stepped forward, his clothes worn, but his posture proud. "You're not from here," he said, voice rough but not unkind. Leora nodded. "We come seeking those who still hold to the old ways. The church's forces are closing in. We need allies." The man's gaze shifted to Rafe and then to Ellen and Mary. "You bring trouble. But these are troubled times." A small group gathered, whispered conversations weaving a tapestry of fear, resilience, and quiet rebellion. Eldermore was no longer a simple village. It was a refuge, a battlefield, a place where old beliefs and harsh realities collided. Ellen felt the weight of responsibility settle more heavily on her shoulders. This was more than survival. It was about preserving a way of life, a faith that refused to die in the shadow of the church. That evening, as the group huddled around a flickering fire, stories began to surface. Tales of secret gatherings held in hidden groves, of sacred rites performed beneath the stars, of voices raised in song despite the church's silence. But with every story came a warning. The church's reach had grown, fueled by fear and zealotry. Neighbors had turned on neighbors, accusations spreading like wildfire. Trust was a fragile thread, easily broken. Ellen looked at Mary, asleep in her arms, and whispered a silent prayer. Not to the church's saints, but to the old spirits Agatha spoke of, to whatever forces still listened in the dark. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a promise and a threat. The battle for Eldermore, and for the souls of its people, was just beginning. And in the shadows, unseen eyes watched, waiting for the moment to strike. The story of how medieval peasants survived the church was far from over. It was a tale of courage and fear, of faith and defiance, woven through with secrets that could change everything. But would Ellen and her companions find the strength to face what was coming? Or would the church's shadow consume them all? Only time would tell. The cold night air settled heavily over Eldermore, wrapping the village in a quiet tension that felt almost alive. Ellen sat near the dying embers of the fire, her gaze fixed on the dark horizon beyond the scattered huts. Each flicker of light seemed to carry a memory of days past, of friends lost, of the church's unyielding watch. Around her, the village breathed with the quiet determination of people who refused to be broken, even when the weight of the church's power pressed down like stone. Rafe was talking quietly with a small group of villagers nearby, his voice steady but urgent. He shared what little news they had gathered from the outskirts. Rumors of new patrols, more interrogations, and the church's increasing paranoia about rebellion. It was clear the church was growing desperate. Ellen wondered what that desperation might drive them to next. Agatha was nearby, seated on a low wooden stool, her hands busy weaving simple charms from strips of cloth and dried herbs. She spoke softly to those who came close, offering whispered words of comfort and protection. The old woman's eyes held something deeper than age, a fierce flame of knowledge and defiance that had survived decades of persecution. Ellen felt a mix of admiration and sorrow for Agatha. She was a living link to a past the church wanted erased, a past filled with rituals, stories, and beliefs that nurtured the land and the people long before the grand stone churches rose on every hill. Yet here they were, forced into hiding, whispers, and shadows. The young woman, Leora, had become a steady presence as well, moving through the village with quiet purpose. She had grown up in Eldermore, and her knowledge of its hidden paths and secret meeting places was invaluable. Yet Ellen saw the weight in Leora's eyes, the fear for the village's future, and the burden of leading others into uncertainty. One evening, as the village gathered in a cramped, dimly lit barn to avoid prying eyes, a hushed conversation unfolded. Bram, the rugged woodsman who had guided them through the forest, stood at the center, outlining a risky plan. He spoke of an ancient meeting place, a ruined chapel deep in the hills where the church's influence had waned over the centuries. The chapel, he said, was rumored to hold relics and texts from a time before the church's dominance. If they could find it, they might uncover truths that could inspire hope, or even a way to resist. The room fell silent. Some villagers exchanged nervous glances, wary of what such a discovery might mean. Others leaned forward, hungry for a spark in the dark. Ellen's heart quickened. The thought of relics, of hidden knowledge, stirred a long-buried hunger inside her, a desire to reclaim a piece of the history and faith the church had tried so hard to erase. Yet Bram's warning was clear. The journey would be dangerous, and the church's patrols were not the only threat. The hills were wild and treacherous, filled with natural hazards and lingering superstitions that kept many from venturing too far. Rafe broke the silence, his voice firm. "If we don't try, we lose everything." Agatha nodded slowly. "The old ways have survived because of those willing to risk everything. We must be brave." Ellen looked around at the faces illuminated by flickering candlelight, some filled with hope, others shadowed by doubt. She thought of Mary, asleep in the arms of a kind neighbor, and the future she wanted to protect. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. The villagers gathered supplies, shared stories, and strengthened bonds. Each moment was tinged with urgency, knowing the church's watchful eyes were never far. Ellen found herself drawn closer to Bram and Leora. Bram's quiet strength and knowledge of the land were a steady anchor, while Leora's fierce loyalty to Eldermore inspired a stubborn hope. Together, they planned a route to the ruined chapel, mapping out the dangers and deciding who could make the journey. But even as plans took shape, tension simmered beneath the surface. Not everyone agreed with the risk, and whispers of betrayal began to circulate. Fear had a way of twisting hearts, and suspicion could turn friend against friend. One night, as the village lay cloaked in darkness, a sharp cry shattered the silence. Ellen bolted upright, her pulse racing. The sound came from the edge of the village, urgent, desperate. Rafe was already moving, his voice calm, but commanding as he rallied others to investigate. Ellen grabbed her cloak and followed, heart pounding. In the dim light, they found a young man collapsed near the woods, bruised and shaken. He gasped out a warning. Church enforcers were coming, closer and more numerous than ever. Panic rippled through the group. Eldermore was no longer a quiet refuge. It was a target. Ellen's mind raced. The time for hiding was ending. They had to act, and fast. But what could a small village of peasants do against the church's might? The old stories spoke of resilience, of faith, of cunning born from years of oppression. But real danger had a way of making even the strongest falter. Ellen looked at Bram, at Leora, at Rafe. Their faces were set with determination, but she could see the fear too. The next steps would decide not just their fate, but the fate of the beliefs and lives they were fighting to protect. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees again, cold and relentless. The church's shadow was closing in, and Eldermore's secrets were still waiting to be uncovered. The days grew darker, the tension thicker, as Eldermore's quiet resistance became a fragile thread stretched to its breaking point. Ellen felt it in the way the villagers moved, eyes darting nervously toward the forest's edge, voices dropping to whispers even in their own homes. The church's presence was no longer a distant threat, but a shadow, creeping closer with every breath. Each morning brought the distant sound of bells tolling from the stone church at the village's outskirts, a grim reminder of the authority watching, waiting. The patrols had become more frequent and more brutal, searching homes, questioning the elderly and children alike. The air was heavy with fear, and the scent of damp earth mixed with smoke from burned-out hearths. Bram's plan to reach the ruined chapel remained their only hope, but the journey was perilous. The paths were muddy, slick with recent rains, and the hills loomed like silent sentinels guarding their secrets. Leora insisted they move quickly, urging the group to leave before the church's forces completely sealed off the village. Ellen's mind was a whirlwind of worry for Mary, for Agatha, for everyone who depended on them. Yet beneath the fear, a fierce determination burned. This was about more than survival. It was about reclaiming a lost world, about the right to believe and live freely. As the small band set out under the cover of pre-dawn shadows, Ellen felt the weight of history pressing down. Each step was a gamble, each breath a prayer. The forest around them whispered with unseen life, rustling leaves, snapping branches, and the occasional hoot of an owl. The wild was both protector and threat. The ruined chapel was said to be hidden deep within the hills, surrounded by thorny brambles and tangled roots that seemed almost alive. Bram led the way, his hands steady as he pushed aside branches and warned them of hidden pitfalls. Leora followed close behind, her sharp eyes scanning every shadow. As they neared the site, the air grew colder, heavier, as if the land itself remembered the centuries of secrets buried there. The chapel's stone walls rose in broken silence, ivy strangling the crumbling facade. Inside, dust and darkness claimed the sacred space, but faint carvings remained visible on the altar, symbols that spoke of a faith older than the church. Ellen's heart pounded as she stepped forward, tracing the worn markings with trembling fingers. Here lay the stories, the relics, proof that their ancestors had lived and believed in ways the church now tried to erase. But their discovery came with a price. The distant crack of a twig, the faint murmur of voices, shattered the fragile quiet. The church's patrols had found them. Panic surged, sharp and cold. The villagers scattered, hearts racing against the pounding of boots and the harsh calls of the enforcers. Ellen grabbed Mary close, her mind racing for escape routes, for hiding places. Through the tangled underbrush, they fled, branches tearing at skin and cloth, lungs burning with exertion. The forest, once a refuge, now felt like a trap closing in. Rafe's voice shouted instructions, urging the group to split up, to confuse the pursuers. But the church's men were relentless, trained, and merciless. Ellen's legs trembled as she pushed forward, every sound magnified. The crash of leaves behind them, the heavy breathing, the harsh commands ordering surrender. The weight of the church's power bore down, a force both physical and spiritual. In that moment, Ellen understood the true cost of resistance. It was not just about defying an institution, but about confronting fear itself. Fear of loss, of pain, of the unknown. Yet even as danger closed in, a quiet strength filled her, a promise whispered by the old gods Agatha spoke of, a fire kindled in the hearts of those who refused to bow. The chase led them toward a narrow ravine, a place of twisted roots and shadowed rock. Ellen's foot caught, and she stumbled, Mary nearly slipping from her arms. Time slowed, breath caught in throat. Behind her, the church's men closed in. But ahead, beyond the ravine, was a faint glimmer of light, a chance for escape, for hope. The story of Eldermore, of the peasants who dared to survive the church, was on the edge of a knife. Would they fall into darkness, or would the light guide them through? The night held its breath, and so did they. The ravine yawned wide before them, its depths swallowed by shadows and tangled vines. Ellen's heart pounded in her chest like a drum, each beat echoing the desperate rhythm of their flight. She steadied Mary in her arms, her fingers gripping the child's small shoulder, grounding herself with the fragile weight of hope and fear intertwined. Behind her, the church's enforcers closed the gap, their footsteps pounding like thunder on the soft earth. Their harsh voices barked orders, cutting through the night air, sharp and unforgiving. Ellen's breath caught in her throat as she searched for footing on the slippery rocks beneath her feet. One wrong step, and they could all be lost. Leora was close beside her, moving with the lithe grace of someone born to the wild. She glanced back once, eyes flashing with fierce determination before turning again toward the faint light across the ravine. "We have to jump," she urged, her voice low but urgent. Ellen swallowed her fear. She could see the other villagers gathering, scrambling up the narrow sides of the ravine, faces pale in the dim light. Bram was already there, extending a hand to help those who hesitated. The edge was closer now, and with one final, desperate glance behind, Ellen took a deep breath and leapt. The air caught in her lungs as she flew forward, the world narrowing to a blur of stone and sky. Her hands grasped at Leora's outstretched fingers, and for a moment, they hung suspended between falling and landing, between capture and freedom. The ground came rushing up, and they hit hard, tumbling into a tangled heap amid dry leaves and sharp twigs. Pain bloomed in Ellen's side, but she pushed it aside, scrambling to her feet. Around her, the others landed one by one, gasping, scrambling, alive. Behind them, the church's men reached the ravine's edge but hesitated, wary of the steep drop and the shadows beyond. They shouted curses, threats, but the villagers were already melting into the dense forest, disappearing like ghosts among the ancient trees. Ellen's legs trembled as she followed the group deeper into the darkness. The weight of Mary in her arms was a constant reminder of what was at stake: the future of their village, their faith, their very lives. The forest closed around them like a living thing, thick branches scratching at their faces, roots threatening to trip even the sure-footed. The wind carried faint whispers, old songs, old prayers, that seemed to seep from the earth itself. They moved with urgency, but every step was heavy with exhaustion and dread. What lay ahead was unknown, and the danger was far from over. Bram's voice broke the silence. "We can't stay out here long. The church will search the forest. We need shelter, somewhere safe." Agatha, leaning on a gnarled staff, nodded slowly. "There's an old cave not far from here. It was used long ago by those who fled persecution. It may still hold safety." The villagers exchanged glances, hope mingling with fear. The cave was a place of stories, a refuge and a prison in one. As they pressed on, Ellen's thoughts drifted back to the chapel, the carved symbols and forgotten relics that might hold the key to their survival. But now, surrounded by the wild, with the church hunting them, that hope seemed distant, almost fragile. Leora caught Ellen's eye. "We've survived worse," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath. Ellen nodded, drawing strength from her words. The church's power was great, but so was their will to endure. Hours passed, the forest growing colder and quieter. At last, they found the cave, a yawning mouth in the hillside, cloaked in shadows and moss. Inside, the air was cool and damp, but it offered shelter from the night and the church's relentless pursuit. The villagers settled in, their bodies aching, minds racing with the unknown. Fires were kindled, stories whispered, prayers muttered into the dark. But even here, safety was fragile. Outside, the church's forces gathered, their resolve hardened by the chase. Ellen sat close to Mary, feeling the steady rhythm of her breath, the soft warmth against the chill. She looked around at the faces lit by firelight, young and old, weary but unbroken. The struggle was far from over. The church's shadow still loomed large, threatening to crush everything they held dear. Yet in the quiet moments between fear and hope, a new strength was born. The strength of people who refused to be erased, who fought to survive, to remember, to believe. The night stretched on, thick with tension and whispered promises. And the dawn would bring a choice, one that could change everything. Would Eldermore's secret past remain buried, or would it rise to challenge the church's rule? The story held its breath, and so did they. The cave walls were damp and cold, but they offered more comfort than the stone cells the villagers feared they might have ended up in. Fires crackled low in the corners, flickering against rock and casting long shadows across the huddled faces. The silence was no longer one of fear, but of heavy waiting. Ellen couldn't sleep. Mary stirred beside her, and she gently tucked the cloak tighter around the child's shoulders. Leora had taken the first watch near the cave's entrance, her eyes constantly shifting toward the trees, listening for movement. So far, nothing. But quiet like this often came before something worse. Just as the dawn light began to drip pale silver through the cracks above, Bram came rushing in, his breath sharp and ragged. His tunic was torn at the sleeve, and his hand were covered in mud. Everyone froze. All eyes turned to him. He wasn't supposed to be gone. "They're not just looking for us," he gasped, falling to his knees. "They've taken over the village, and they've started tearing apart the abbey." A cold silence fell like a stone. Ellen stood up slowly. "The chapel?" she asked. "The one we found?" Bram nodded. "The same. They think it's heresy. They brought in men from the city, not just soldiers, but priests in black robes. Ones that don't ask questions, only destroy." Gasps rippled through the group. For the villagers of Eldermore, the chapel hadn't been just old stones and moss-covered walls. It had been a connection to something older than the church's power, something deeper and more human, something that gave them hope. Agatha spoke next, her voice rasping with age but still clear. "They know what lies beneath it," she whispered. "The foundation of the faith before the bishops rewrote it, before the power and the politics. They're trying to erase it again." Ellen felt a slow, building pressure in her chest. "We can't let them." But what could they do? Armed soldiers patrolled the streets now. Priests declared what was holy and what was not. And they, just peasants, bakers, shepherds, and mothers, were exiles. Still, something had shifted. They had fled before because they were afraid. But now it felt different. Now they were angry. As murmurs spread through the cave, Leora stood from her place near the entrance. Her face was pale, but her eyes were burning. "They're not only destroying the chapel," she said quietly. "They've taken Father Aldrich." The name stopped even the quietest whispers. Father Aldrich had been a mystery for years. Part priest, part scholar, he had once served the church but had quietly broken away. He lived on the outskirts, tending to the poor, offering help without judgment. He had warned many of them that change was coming. That truth, once buried, would eventually demand to be seen again. They dragged him from his cottage. Leora said, her jaw tight. He tried to protect the old texts, the ones he found, the ones about the time before the church's rule. They think he's the heart of the rebellion. A rush of panic mixed with fury passed through the group. Ellen clenched her fists. Aldrich had once been the only one who ever spoke to her without looking down. He had helped her understand that faith didn't have to mean obedience to cruelty. "They'll burn him," Bram said bluntly. "They'll make an example of him." The air inside the cave grew heavier. The tension had crept past fear and into something sharper. Not one of them knew how to fight with swords, but all of them knew how to defend something they believed in. But before they could act, another figure appeared at the cave entrance, soaked from the rain and panting hard. It was Tomer, one of the younger shepherds who had been sent to scout the eastern hills. "They're not just burning buildings," he said breathlessly. "They've brought relics from the bishop's tower. Old things. They're using them, casting fear into the people, saying that Eldermore was cursed from the beginning, that our bloodline carries heresy." The words stunned even Agatha into silence. Bloodline? Heresy? Ellen's mind spun. Why would they say that? Tomer hesitated, his eyes scanning the cave's dim light. "Because they found something," he said. "Beneath the chapel. A stone tablet, marked with names from our village. Family names. And one of them is yours, Ellen." The firelight seemed to flicker in time with her heartbeat. Ellen's mouth went dry. "That can't be." Tomer nodded. "They said it was a record of those who kept the old ways alive, hidden away after the purge. You're descended from them. Maybe more of us are." Leora stepped forward, her hand on Ellen's arm. "They're rewriting history again, but this time they have proof. And they're using that proof to destroy every trace of who we are." The cave's air tightened with fear and urgency. The church's reach was no longer just in scripture or sermons. It had turned to blood and legacy. Now it wasn't only about belief, but identity. And with Aldrich in chains, their history, and possibly their future, hung by a thread. Agatha's eyes closed slowly. This is why they feared us. Not because of swords or numbers, but because we remember what they tried to erase. Ellen felt it then, the storm brewing not just in the sky, but inside them. The kind of storm that comes when truth collides with tyranny. They couldn't go back. Not yet. But the choice was clear. The old ways couldn't remain buried any longer. The time for hiding was over. But as they began to speak in hushed tones of what to do next, of how to reach Aldrich or retrieve the text before they were lost forever, none of them noticed the figure watching them from the trees beyond the cave entrance. A hooded man, cloaked in silence, whose allegiance had not yet been revealed. And he wasn't alone. The forest, long believed to be their ally, had new shadows now. And not all of them were friendly. The moment passed in silence as the figure in the woods withdrew without a sound. The villagers, huddled in the cave, were too consumed by their plans, their panic, and the weight of something much bigger than themselves. The fire crackled low. The mossy walls breathed the chill of early dusk, but no one felt the cold anymore. Ellen leaned closer to the flame, her thoughts racing. Her name had been on the stone. Her family, unknown to her until now, was part of something ancient, something the church had tried to erase for centuries. And now, because of that history, they were in danger. What do they mean? Our bloodline, she asked quietly, her voice dry from the smoke and dust. What could we possibly carry that frightens them so much? Agatha, who had been quiet for some time, finally raised her head. Her eyes, pale and cloudy with age, still carried the sharpness of someone who remembered too much. It isn't your blood they fear, child, she said. It's your memory. The words hung in the air. There were stories, Agatha continued, her voice slow and steady. From before my time. Whispers that some families held onto the old rites, not the kind taught from pulpits, but those passed through the hands of mothers and midwives. Songs, symbols, ways of healing. The church called it pagan, heresy, but it was older than their cathedrals. It was rooted in the land itself. But why now? Bram asked, arms crossed tightly over his chest. Why dig it up now? We've been living quietly. They must be scared, said Leora, to go this far. They wouldn't burn a chapel or arrest a priest just to make a show. There's something they want to keep buried. A pause. Ellen looked from face to face. They all knew the answer, even if they couldn't say it aloud. Truth, and perhaps something worse. The truth that the church hadn't created faith, only reshaped it, taken what belonged to the people and turned it into chains. Tomer returned from the entrance with a short nod. No signs of movement, he whispered. But the winds changed. Smoke in the east. Another fire? Bram asked. Tomer nodded. Could be the mill. A wave of anger swept through the room. The mill had fed half the village. Burning it wasn't just an act of control, it was punishment. They're trying to cut us off, Leora said. Force us to return, starved and desperate. They want us crawling, Bram added bitterly, so they can rebuild the lie and call it mercy. But something shifted in Ellen's posture. What if we don't let them? Bram raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? What if we don't crawl back at all? What if we stop hiding and start remembering? What if we use the stories they tried to erase? The group fell quiet again. You said we carried memory, Ellen said to Agatha. Then maybe it's time to use it. Agatha looked at her a long time, then slowly nodded. There are still places the church has never touched, she said. Stone circles lost in forests. Springs that never dried, even in the worst years. People like Aldrich, who never gave up on the old ways. If we gather them, maybe we can find what they were afraid of us finding. More than memory, Bram said, a little dazed. A movement. We don't need to fight with swords, Ellen said. Not if we stand together. The truth can do more damage to their empire than any blade. But just as the fire in their hearts began to burn brighter, the cave air shifted. It was Leora who heard it first, the faint crack of a branch outside, followed by a heavy pause. Tomer reached for the axe he had sharpened just hours before. The others froze. Another sound. Closer. Bram stood and crept toward the entrance. Stay back, he murmured. But before he reached it, the figure stepped into the light. A young man, maybe no older than 20, with a face covered in dirt and a torn brown cloak draped over his shoulders. He raised his hands immediately. "I'm not with them," he said. "Please, I need to talk to Ellen." Ellen's breath caught. "How do you know me?" she asked. The boy lowered his hood. His eyes were a strange mix of familiarity and pain. "I'm Ura. My father served the bishop until he found the tablet. He fled the city before they could silence him. But they found him. He pulled a roll of parchment from his cloak and held it out, trembling. He told me to find you, that if anyone could finish what he started, it would be someone from Eldermore." Ellen stepped forward slowly and took the scroll. The seal was broken. The ink was old. She unrolled it with care. Inside was a map, faded, torn at the corners, but clear enough to see what had once been hidden. It wasn't just the chapel. There were 5 sites marked in red. Places of gathering, ritual, memory. "I think it's the locations of the old circles," Ura said. "My father believed if someone stood in each, something would happen. Something the church never wanted." Bram stepped beside her. "What kind of something?" Ura shook his head. He didn't say, only that the people would remember who they were. A long silence followed. Then Agatha, despite her age, stood. "Then we must go. Tonight?" Leora asked. "Yes, before they burn what's left." No one spoke against it. Not now. But just before they could leave, another voice echoed from the mouth of the cave, sharp and cruel. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Every heart in the cave froze. A group of cloaked men stepped out from the shadows, weapons drawn, led by a tall figure in dark robes. His eyes gleamed with firelight and power. "You thought you could hide truth in caves and whispers," he said. "But you forgot. We taught you how to fear." And as the swords drew near and the map fluttered in Ellen's hands, the last warmth of the fire died. The next choice would define everything. Ellen didn't have time to think. The robed man's voice echoed in the cave like thunder rolling across a field, and in the stillness that followed, she saw the flicker of steel in his hand. Her heart thudded, so loud it drowned out everything else. Bram moved instinctively, stepping in front of her, his arm shielding her chest like a wall of resolve. But Ellen didn't step back. She tightened her grip on the map, now crumpled and damp with sweat, and whispered to herself, "We didn't come this far to hide again." The others around her, Tomer, Laura, Agatha, were frozen only for a moment. Tomer's axe was in his hand before the first of the cloaked men stepped forward. Leora grabbed the closest torch from the cave wall and thrust it toward the intruders, the flame flaring bright against the damp air. They weren't warriors, not trained for battle, but desperation made them bold. The cave erupted into chaos. Sparks flew as metal clashed, torches swung wild in the dark, and fists found bone. The robed man didn't move much. He watched, arms crossed, like a conductor waiting for the right note. But Ellen wasn't watching the fight. Her eyes were locked on the parchment in her hands, now glowing faintly in the firelight, the ink shimmering as though it had awakened. She heard Agatha cry out, then silence. Her heart twisted, but she couldn't look. She couldn't lose focus. Her instincts told her that if she could just trace the lines, just see the whole picture, maybe they had a chance. Ura pulled her back just as one of the robed men lunged with a blade. Bram tackled him mid-swing, grunting as they hit the floor. Ellen stumbled into the side wall of the cave and finally caught her breath. The map, now half spread across a flat stone surface, pulsed under her fingertips. "It's not just a map," she said, barely able to hear her own voice through the noise. "It's a key." Ura crouched beside her, panting. "Then use it. Whatever it does, do it now." Ellen stared at the markings. 5 sites, 5 ancient places. But now something had changed. A small, hidden symbol near the center began to reveal itself under the heat of the fire. A 6th mark. "No," she whispered. "There's one more." Ura followed her gaze. "That's Eldermore." The fight raged behind them, but something shifted in the air. Ellen turned, firelight flickering over her face, and called out, loud and clear, "Bram." He turned, blood on his cheek and rage in his eyes. "The last circle. It's here. Right here," she said. "This cave, it's the 6th place." Bram looked around, and for the first time saw the carvings half hidden in the rock walls, faded, ancient symbols etched by hands long forgotten. The same symbols on the map. Ellen, what do we do? She didn't answer immediately. She stepped forward, holding the map with both hands, and read the lines aloud. Not in Latin, but in the old tongue, the words her grandmother had once whispered while combing her hair, the songs that had no place in any sermon, but lived in lullabies and harvest chants. As she spoke, the symbols on the cave walls began to glow, softly at first, then with growing strength. The fighting slowed. Even the robed man turned, his smug expression twisting into something like confusion. The cave trembled, not violently, but like a breath being drawn after a long silence. A pulse of light burst from the map and spread across the floor in a ring, outlining a symbol beneath their feet, a wheel surrounded by 6 points. The robed man stepped forward, eyes wide with disbelief. "That's not possible," he muttered. "You're just peasants." "Exactly," Ellen said, and we remember. The light surged upward, enveloping everyone. For a moment, no one could see anything. Just warmth, silence, peace. When the light faded, the cave was still. The robed man was gone. His followers, disarmed and dazed, sat slumped against the wall, as though whatever force had driven them had vanished. The sword that had once gleamed in the robed man's hand lay cold and dull on the cave floor. Ellen dropped the map. It no longer pulsed. It was quiet now, its work complete. "What happened?" Bram asked, kneeling beside her. "I think we called them back," she whispered. "Called who back?" "The voices of those who remembered before us." Agatha stirred, coughing weakly. Leora helped her sit upright. Tomer, bleeding from a gash above his brow, stumbled to the entrance and looked out. "The fires are out," he said. "The village, there's no more smoke." They emerged slowly into the night. Eldermore lay quiet beneath a blanket of stars, its buildings still standing, untouched by fire, as if whatever had held the soldiers' rage had been lifted all at once. Yura turned to Ellen. "It worked." But Ellen didn't answer right away. Something didn't feel right. She looked back at the cave entrance, the glow of the symbols fading into stone once again. One by one, they disappeared. Except one. A single mark remained, faint but visible. A new line drawn just under the 6th circle, leading into a blank part of the parchment that hadn't been there before. Ellen's breath caught. "There's more." "What do you mean?" Bram asked, already sounding tired. She handed him the scroll, pointing to the faint path. "The church thought there were only 6. They were wrong. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning." They stared at the parchment. The new line wound toward a place not marked by names or roads, deep into the forest, where even old folk feared to wander. "We're not done yet," she said. "Not until the truth is free." Yura frowned. "Do we even know what's waiting for us out there?" Ellen looked ahead, eyes sharp with a fire that hadn't been there before. "No," she said, "but we won't be afraid to find out." Tools. The morning after the cave had lit up with forgotten voices and ancient power, Eldermore was quiet, eerily so. Chickens rustled in their pens, children crept through the alleys whispering, and the church bell, normally rung by Father Marrow at dawn, remained silent. The villagers walked slowly, some with bandaged arms and soot-stained clothes, as if the night had been only a terrible dream they dared not remember. But Ellen remembered every moment. She sat with the others on the stone wall, just beyond the edge of the village. The map lay between them, weighted down with a piece of bread someone had set there and forgotten. The strange new path that had revealed itself after the light faded was still there, faint, uncertain, but undeniably real. The parchment no longer shimmered, yet it hummed with a quiet energy like a heartbeat under skin. Bram traced the path with his finger. "That forest, no one goes there." "They say it's cursed," said Agatha, who was pale but recovering. "It's not cursed," Yura replied quietly. "It's just forgotten, like everything else." Ellen looked up from the map. If the church missed this, if their own priests didn't know what we found, then what else don't they know? Or Bram said, what do they know that they've hidden? The question settled over the group like a shadow. The events of the past days had upended everything they thought they knew about the world they lived in, The church, the sermons, the punishments, the land itself. For generations, their lives had been boxed in by rules written by men they never saw and enforced by men they feared. But now something larger had stirred, and Ellen couldn't shake the sense that they had only peeled back the first layer. A faint breeze stirred the trees beyond the pasture, and with it came the sound of distant chanting. Not loud, more like a hum that grew and faded, like someone breathing through the leaves. "It's already starting again," Leora whispered. The others turned to her. "They'll send someone," she said. "They always do. If that man in the cave was part of something bigger, they won't just let this go." Yura nodded slowly. "They'll come looking for him. And when they do," Ellen added, "they'll find an empty cave and a map they can't read." That night, they gathered in Bram's barn to talk in private. The fires were low, the hay smelled faintly of old smoke, and the rafters above creaked in the cool wind. A few others joined them, people who had seen the light or heard the strange stillness when the soldiers stopped their march. They all sat in a circle, listening as Ellen shared what they had found. Not everyone believed. Some shook their heads and left early, muttering about blasphemy. Others stayed, eyes wide and wondering, asking questions they'd never dare to speak aloud. What if the church had rewritten stories? What if there had once been other ways to live, to believe, to understand the world? Ellen didn't have all the answers, but she had one thing they hadn't had before: proof that something else existed, something older, buried beneath doctrine and silence. The following morning, they prepared for the journey. Ellen, Bram, Yura, Agatha, and Leora. 5 villagers, none trained in war, none carrying anything more than satchels of bread, old cloaks, and a stubborn belief that they had to see this through. The forest at the edge of the world was known in whispers as the Hollowing. It had no marked trail, no name on the Lord's tax maps, and no visit from traveling friars. The few stories that remained spoke of wild spirits, twisted trees, and ground that swallowed footsteps. But the map pointed there, and Ellen felt the pull. They left at dawn, just as the first frost softened under the sun. The village watched them go in silence, some with pity, others with quiet awe. As they crossed the last fence and passed the final stone marker, Ellen paused and looked back. She saw a mother holding her child's hand, an old man leaning on a stick, a baker with flour on her sleeves, all staring, unsure of what would happen next. And still, no one stopped them. The edge of the forest rose like a wall, thick and dark, branches hanging low like arms stretched to block the way. Ellen stepped forward first, her feet crunching on dry leaves, and the others followed. The trees swallowed them within minutes. Inside the hollowing, light bent strangely. Shadows twisted in slow circles, and the air smelled of damp stone and bark older than memory. No birds sang, no streams bubbled, just the soft sound of their own breath and the crunch of boots over roots and moss. They moved carefully, stopping often to check the map, though no path was marked. Instead, the lines led in curves and spirals, more like a dream's direction than a road. On the second day, they found the stones, carved monoliths, standing tall among the trees, covered in the same markings as the cave and the scroll. One stone had fallen and split, revealing a hollow core filled with ashes. Another leaned toward a tree that had grown around it, the bark swallowing the edge of the symbols. Yura ran his fingers over the carvings. These were warnings, or instructions, Ellen said. They camped there that night, surrounded by ancient stone and thick silence. Around the fire, Ellen watched the flames and thought of her father, how he used to tell her that life was about doing what you're told, not asking why. But maybe he was wrong. Maybe why was the most important question of all. She woke in the middle of the night to a sound like humming, low and soft, like a lullaby. She turned slowly, not wanting to wake the others, and saw a figure in the trees, just for a moment. A woman, or the shadow of one, tall and cloaked, watching them. No face, no motion, just there, and then gone. Ellen sat awake until dawn. By the 5th day, they reached the clearing. It was circular like the one in the cave, but much larger. In the center stood a stone structure, crumbling, covered in vines, yet unmistakably shaped like a chapel. But this was no church-built shrine. It had no cross, no altar, no pews. Just a hollow, echoing chamber with walls filled with more of the old symbols. And in the middle, a basin of stone filled with water as still as glass. They entered cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the dry air. Ellen approached the basin. She saw her reflection, tired, worn, and yet clearer than ever before. And then, beneath the surface, a second image, the woman she had seen in the woods. But this time, the woman looked at her and smiled. "Ellen," Bram said quietly, "what do you see?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into the water. Her fingers touched something solid, a stone plate, round like a disc. She pulled it free. The markings on it glowed faintly, and as she turned it over, a piece of parchment floated to the surface. A second map, but this one had no landmarks, no villages, no trails. Just names. Names of people. Hundreds of them. She held it up to the light, her hands trembling. Yura stepped closer and read aloud a few of the names. "These aren't nobles or kings," he said. "They're us. These are common folk. They're the ones who remembered," Ellen whispered. "Remembered what?" Ellen turned to face them. Everything. Behind her, the basin began to ripple, and the wind outside shifted. Something was coming, and it remembered them too. Tools. The wind howled through the cracks in the stone walls like a warning. Leaves stirred outside the ruined chapel, whispering across the moss-covered floor like they carried secrets of their own. Ellen stood frozen, staring at the map of names in her trembling hands. The ink shimmered faintly in the dim light filtering through the broken roof. The names weren't just written, they felt etched into something deeper, almost alive, as if the parchment carried memory itself. Bram stepped back toward the entrance, eyes scanning the forest edge. "Someone's coming," he said. "I can feel it." Yura gripped the hilt of his small hunting knife, though he knew it would do little against whatever had stirred the wind. "We shouldn't have come alone." "We weren't alone," Leora whispered. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with recognition. "They've been following us since the first stone." Agatha looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "I don't know who or what they are," Leora said, "but I saw them. Twice now. The woman Ellen saw, I saw her too. In the trees behind us. Just watching. Never getting closer." Ellen's voice was quiet, but steady. "They're not here to stop us. If they were, they would have already. So what do they want?" Yura asked. No one answered. But the silence wasn't empty anymore. It buzzed like the pause between lightning and thunder. Then, suddenly, the stone basin trembled. Water sloshed against the rim and spilled down its carved sides. The walls flickered with pale light, the symbols glowing briefly like the embers of a dying fire. Then the ground beneath them shifted. Bram stumbled and caught himself on the wall. "Earth's moving." "No," Ellen whispered. "It's opening." A faint click echoed through the chapel, and a section of the floor began to sink. Slowly, carefully, the stone gave way to reveal a spiral staircase beneath them. It descended into darkness, but warm light flickered below, inviting and unnatural. Ellen glanced at the others. "We came this far." Without waiting, she stepped down into the unknown. The stairway smelled like ash and damp stone, but it was dry. The deeper they went, the warmer it grew. By the time they reached the bottom, the scent had changed, burnt parchment, iron, and something like old incense. A chamber stretched before them, circular and low-ceilinged. Symbols lined the walls here too, but they were older, more intricate, like stories etched in stone. And in the center stood a pedestal with a broken seal. It looked as though it had been cracked open from within. "What was in there?" Bram asked. Yura pointed toward the scattered shards at its base. "Looks like it wasn't meant to stay in there forever." Leora walked to the far wall. A mural stretched across it, faded and chipped, but still powerful. It showed people kneeling, not in prayer, but in protest, facing towers that glowed with light. Soldiers with blank faces stood behind them, weapons lowered, uncertain. And at the top of the mural, drawn with thicker lines and darker stone, stood a woman. The same woman Ellen had seen. Her face was calm, eyes wide open, hair flowing like smoke. Her hands weren't raised in warning. They were open, like she was offering something. Ellen's voice cracked. I think she was one of them. Before everything changed, Agatha frowned. Them. The ones who remembered who we really are, Ellen said. Before the church. Before the silence. A sudden noise rang out above, sharp, metallic. Boots. Several pairs. Bram turned, face pale. They found us. Yora grabbed the map, rolled it quickly, and handed it to Ellen. Go. There has to be another way out. But what about? They won't ask questions, Ellen. Not the kind we're trying to answer. Footsteps grew louder above. Voices echoed, controlled, commanding. Ellen turned and ran to the far side of the chamber. She pushed against the walls, searched for seams, anything. Then her fingers caught the edge of a small opening hidden behind a loose stone. This way, she shouted. They ducked into the narrow passage just as light poured down the stairwell behind them. Shadows moved fast, too fast. Torchlight painted the edges of the chamber as armored boots slammed against the stone. They were just here, someone growled. A second voice barked, fan out. If they have it, we take them alive. Orders from the high sanctum. The passage Ellen and the others fled into grew tighter the further they went. They crawled at times, the stones scraping elbows and knees. Still, no one stopped. The fear wasn't just about being caught. It was the idea of losing the truth again, of the world snapping back into silence before they could speak it aloud. They emerged hours later, breathless and bruised, into a different part of the forest, further north, past the river and near the mountains. The sun was already setting, casting long gold rays through the trees. They collapsed beneath a ridge, hidden by brush, finally allowing themselves to breathe. Ellen unrolled the second map. The names were still there, but now something new had appeared, a red mark near the base. A new location, unnamed. Agatha leaned over her shoulder. Another place? Or someone? Ellen replied. They all sat in silence for a moment, listening to the forest shift around them. Birds returned, chirping cautiously. A rabbit darted through the brush. Life was still happening, even as something ancient stirred beneath their feet. Leora whispered, What if they find the chapel? They will, Yora said. Bram nodded. But they won't find what they're looking for. Ellen held the map tightly. Because it's not there anymore. It's here. It's us. And with that, the wind shifted again. But this time, it didn't bring fear. It brought footsteps, soft, careful, human. They turned quickly, bracing for another soldier or spy. But it was a child, barefoot, covered in ash, eyes wide with wonder. He held something out in his hand. A piece of stone, broken, ancient, marked with the same symbols as the basin. Ellen took it gently. Where did you get this? She asked. The boy pointed over his shoulder toward the dark woods. From her, he said simply. She told me you would come. Who? Leora asked, already knowing. The boy looked up, his face solemn and full of something much older than his years. The woman with the eyes that see everything. And then he was gone, slipping into the trees like he had never been there at all. The group stared at each other, each one realizing the same truth. This wasn't over. The past hadn't been buried. It had just been waiting to be remembered. The fire crackled gently as night settled in around them, the shadows of the trees stretching long and still. They had made camp on the edge of the old northern ridge, far from the chapel, far from the stone basin and broken seal. The wind had grown calm, almost like it was listening. Ellen sat closest to the fire, the map spread across her lap, its faintly glowing lines now fully lit under the pale moonlight. The red mark the boy had revealed was no longer just a location. It had transformed. It now formed a circle, connecting all the previous points they'd visited. It was clear now. The places, the names, the symbols, they were never meant to be understood in isolation. They were part of something whole. Yura sat next to her, sharpening a stick absently. So, it was never about what was hidden in that pedestal. It was about what had already been released. Agatha nodded, a quiet sadness in her eyes. And maybe that's what they feared most. Not that we'd find something dangerous, but that we'd remember something true. Leora, wrapped in a wool blanket, looked up from where she was tending a pot of tea. The woman in the mural. She wasn't trying to stop the world from changing. She was trying to remind it of what it used to be. Bram added quietly, she was one of them. A guardian, maybe, a voice from before the silence. For the first time in weeks, no one rushed to speak. They just sat there, taking it all in. The weight of the journey had finally settled in their bones. Every chase, every coded message, every close call, it had led here. And though they weren't standing in front of tower or facing down the church, they all knew something important had happened. Ellen gently folded the map and tucked it into her satchel. We have to tell people, not just about what we saw, but what we learned. The truth isn't a weapon, it's a light. And people deserve to see it. Do you really think they'll believe us? Bram asked. Yura smiled. That's not the point. It's not about convincing everyone. It's about planting something. A question. A doubt. Enough to start the next ripple. They spent the night watching the stars shift above the trees. No one came for them. The silence was finally just silence. Not a threat, not a warning. By morning, they had made a plan. They would split up, each going to different towns and regions, sharing the story in pieces. Not like a grand declaration, but like passing along something sacred, something meant to be remembered. Agatha chose the coastal villages. She had once lived near the sea and still knew people who'd listen. Leora would head to the eastern farms, where tradition ran deep, but stories still traveled fast. Bram and Yura would go north, toward the mountain cities, using the old trade routes. Ellen, with a map, would return to the city where it all began. They hugged each other tightly before leaving. There were no guarantees, but there was courage. Weeks passed, then months. In quiet corners of markets and behind closed doors, people began whispering, not out of fear, but with hope. Stories of the symbols reappearing in old carvings. Reports of strangers leaving marked stones at temple doors. Children drawing the woman with open hands in the dirt. And slowly, the church began to notice. But instead of immediate force, they responded with silence. Maybe because they didn't understand it all yet. Or maybe because they feared stirring something they had buried long ago. In the capital, Ellen lived quietly under another name, teaching in a small school. But every so often, a stranger would knock at her door, someone with a question, a dream, or a piece of stone they didn't understand. She would smile, offer them tea, and listen. Then she'd show them the map. And when they left different. One evening, years later, Ellen sat at a worn wooden table, sketching symbols into a notebook. A knock came, soft, familiar. She opened the door and found a boy, no older than 12. His eyes were wide, his hair tousled, and in his hand, he held something small and smooth. I was told you'd know what this is, he said. Ellen gently took the object. It was a carved stone, circular, with the open hands etched into its surface. Where did you get this? She asked, voice soft. A woman gave it to me in the woods. She didn't say much, just that I'd understand later. Ellen smiled, her eyes misting. Come in. Let me show you something. She unrolled the old map, now cracked and faded but still pulsing with warmth. The circle was complete, but around its edges, new marks had begun to form, points no one in the original group had ever seen. New names, new voices. She looked at the boy. What's your name? Micah. Well, Micah, she said gently, you're part of something much bigger now. The camera fades out from Ellen's cabin, the firelight flickering softly in the window. The forest outside remains calm, the trees bending in the wind, but not in fear. In greeting. Somewhere out there, someone else has started to ask the right questions. Somewhere, another child is picking up a stone and listening to the echoes inside. And though the church still stands, its silence no longer holds the same power. Because now, the truth is awake. It lives in the stories passed between strangers. It grows in the questions whispered behind closed doors. It moves like wind through the forest. It cannot be unlearned, and it cannot be stopped. Tools,